We rely on forests and trees for so much, to support nature recovery, reduce the impact of climate change, and provide a sustainable source of timber, to name but a few. But the world is in the grip of a climate and biodiversity crisis. Our woodlands are in a state of flux. UK trees and the species which rely on them for food and shelter are experiencing a huge range of threats. Many of our woods and forests are dominated by a single tree species. While this can make some operations and management easier, it means the woods are less resilient. If climate change or a pest or pathogen impacts the dominant tree in the woodland, then the whole woodland is lost. In a more diverse woodland, the same tree species could be impacted by climate change or a pest or pathogen, but only a few trees would be lost and the woodland would continue to function. A more diverse woodland will not only make the wood itself more resilient, it can also help support the wildlife that lives there. This, of course, depends on which species use which trees, and it doesn't mean we necessarily have to diversify the tree species composition of a woodland with novel species not currently present in the UK. It might mean diversifying with native species. Individual woods with a wider range of tree species are likely to deliver an increased range of ecosystem functions, for instance, pollination or supporting biodiversity. DiversiTree is looking at how we move from woods and forests dominated by a few species to more diverse woodlands at a range of scales, taking into account the diversity of management objectives.
So unfortunately, we were seeing an exponential increase in the number of tree pests and pathogens in the UK. So just for an example, between 1950 and 1990, we saw 4 tree pests and pathogens that really had a detrimental impact, and that's in 40 years. But between 1990 and 2020, we saw 19. And many of these are coming from abroad because of the increase in global trade. And unfortunately, our trees haven't co-evolved with those pests and pathogens, so they can't automatically fight them off. And in many cases, this is having a devastating impact on particular populations of trees. And there's also some concern about the impacts of climate change on the forests as well. So the DiversiTree project is looking at the diversification of tree species with 4 main aims. So in a woodland, when we're thinking about diversity, we've got far more than just the tree species we want to think about. So firstly, we're wanting to think about the species that are associated with the trees. Our trees are what we call foundation species. They support a lot of other species. And if you lose that tree species, we want other trees around them to continue to support that biodiversity. So we're very much looking at what tree species can substitute for each other, because not all tree species are equal. You can't just replace our pine trees here with any other tree species. They won't support the same biodiversity. So that's one of our aims. We're also thinking about the microbiome, which is the microbes, the bacteria and the fungi that are on the leaves of the tree, and whether the composition of that community on the needles changes as the tree species composition changes, because potentially that could actually help in terms of providing ecosystem health and promoting the health of the trees and fighting off other fungal infections. And then thirdly, we're really wanting to look at the objectives that the woodland managers have. Woodlands have a whole range of different objectives. Managers have different ways of managing them. There's a whole diversity of objectives out there, and we're wanting to see how those objectives can be fitted in with diversification, and what are the barriers to diversification and what things could potentially change to enable diversification to occur. We'd also like to get the results from our research out to woodland managers and make the results available so that they can actually use the results in how they're managing their woods and forests.
The DiversiTree project has concentrated on woods and forests, dominated by Sitka spruce or Scots pine, our most prevalent non-native and native conifer species respectively. The DiversiTree project has shown there are 564 species that use Sitka spruce, with 6 of these only found on Sitka. We also found that Scots pine supports 1,589 species, 215 of which are only found on Scots pine. Of course, not all these species will be present on every Sitka spruce or Scots pine tree. The presence of a given species will depend on various factors.
We're having to rethink about what tree species we might want in our woods and forests. We've often got quite preconceived ideas on what tree species we think are suitable in particular habitats. And climate change is having to make us rethink those. It could be not necessarily non-native species, but just thinking about other native species moving into slightly different habitats.
If we are to improve the resilience of UK woodland through tree species diversification, it is important to take an evidence-based approach that puts practitioners at the heart of the solution.